After the Jewish temple was destroyed in AD 70, what were the Jews to do? How were they supposed to practice their religion? Since Josiah's reforms in the 600s BC, they believed that they were forbidden to sacrifice anywhere but at the temple in Jerusalem. Well, there were two schools of thought. The Rabbis, we know them as the New Testament's Pharisees, they saw this as their opportunity to increase their influence, and they established synagogues for the study of the Torah, the law, along with prayer and singing. Eventually, this is the sect of Judaism that won out. The rabbis defined modern Judaism and continue to govern it to this day. But there was another school of thought, one that was led by the now templeless temple priests. These priests built synagogues of their own and tried to make them as close as they could to the temple in everything but the sacrifices. One of these synagogues at Dura Europos in Syria was discovered in the 1920s and excavated in 1932. It had been built in the 200s AD by a priest named Samuel, but it was buried in shifting sands after the city was abandoned during a siege. Stunning murals, 21 feet high, depict scenes that archaeologists believe were enacted ritually. Scenes of heavenly ascent, the stepwise progression of the worshiper into the presence of God. Of course, in broad outline, this is what our own temple endowment is. The Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who lived at the time of Christ, wrote about just this sort of thing, of being initiated into the higher mysteries, he said, by Moses. He compared Judaism of his day to the Greek mystery religions, like Pythagoreanism and Orphism, whose goal was to bring the individual into the presence of the God. But in the past, scholars had always thought Philo's views of Judaism were unconventional or unique to himself. Not so now. There clearly had to be large numbers of Jews who followed this strain of Judaism that wanted to preserve the non-sacrificial aspects of the temple and who acted out rituals of heavenly ascent. Let's survey a few things that are interesting about this Dura Europos synagogue. First, we see the bread and wine of the Messianic meal depicted. Of course, this was a feature of the ancient temple, where the showbread and drink offering of wine were laid out in the holy place. Next, we see that there are marks on Moses' garments. These are called gammedia, and are commonly seen in the art of early Jewish and Christian portrayals of prophets and saints. Their original significance is not known for certain, except that similar marks appeared on the veil that covered the Ark of the Covenant and the veil of the hypostasis in basilicas of the Eastern churches, like this one. It seems very strange indeed that Jews could have portrayed the pagan musician Orpheus in their synagogue. But Jews of the era actually equated Orpheus with King David, and he represented harmonious and holy music. The lion represented the Messiah of the tribe of Judah, the Redeemer. Some ancient art historians believe that the depiction of the sons of Joseph, just to the side, alludes to the Messiah of the tribe of Joseph, the restorer who would also be martyred. This was an important strain of belief anciently, though it's neglected today, that there was a second Messiah of the tribe of Joseph or Ephraim that would come in the last days to restore the law. In one panel, Moses' progression through life is shown, from the burning bush, then receiving the law, teaching the people, and finally in his old age, ascending to heaven. This was an artistic depiction of the progression that the worshippers at this synagogue hoped to make, and which archaeologists believe they enacted ritually. Ezekiel is also shown going through a similar progression. He changes from the red Persian style, that is, worldly clothing, to simple white, and back again as he returns to earth after his visit to heaven and is martyred. Specific hand gestures of unknown significance are shown. Other synagogues discovered in the 1900s add to the belief that there was this alternate form of Judaism that sought to preserve aspects of the temple, heavenly ascent, and union with God. This is the mosaic that formed the floor of the synagogue at Beit Alpha from the 6th century AD. Archaeologists believe that this and similar mosaics in other synagogues from the same time period convey a stepwise progression from outside the synagogue in the profane world all the way into the divine presence. This, of course, is just what the original temples did. For example, on the High Holy Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the high priest symbolically reversed the path of Adam and Eve's expulsion from God's presence in the Garden of Eden. He progressed from outside the temple in the courtyard into the holy place, then past the cherubim guardians that were embroidered on the veil to enter the Holy of Holies, and there pour out the sacrificial offering at the Ark of the Covenant, which was the symbolic throne of God. In the first panel of the mosaic, we see Abraham binding Isaac for the sacrifice, just as animal sacrifice was carried out in the courtyard outside the holy place of the temple. Next, we see the Greek zodiac, and this has puzzled archaeologists and historians a great deal. From our perspective, it seems doubtful that presumably observant Jews would allow artistic representations in a house of worship anyway, much less representations that are obviously of pagan gods and cosmologies. The rabbis absolutely forbade it, and there are no artistic representations in the synagogues they built. But not all ancient Jews understood the second commandment the same way. Many believed it was not the representation of such things that was forbidden, but the worship of those representations. And that's how you could have items in Solomon's temple like the Nehushtan, which was the brass serpent, and also the two cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant, and the menorah that represented the tree of life and Asherah, God's wife. The Jews that built Beit Alpha synagogue and others of the same time period did not recognize the prohibition against depicting these things that the rabbis would later enforce. But why pagan gods? We saw earlier that Jews freely identified the Greek Orpheus with their own king David, and it's the same here. They adapted the Greek symbols of the culture all around them to their own specific meanings. The sun god Helios occupies the center of most of these zodiac mosaics. The Jews associated Helios with Metatron. In what is called the Archaeological literature, Metatron was the name given to the prophet Enoch once he became a heavenly being. He was the most important mystagogue, that is, a person that initiates others into sacred mysteries. The Archaeological literature is all about the heavenly temple where God dwells. In the ancient temple, the high priest passed from the outer courtyard into the holy place, then into the Holy of Holies. As he passed through the veil, he would have noted the embroidered cherubim, symbolic of the solemn and powerful guardians that prevented Adam and Eve's re-entry into the Garden of Eden. The Archaeological literature takes this imagery much further. It purports to demonstrate how one could successfully pass by the various gates and the guardians that stand as sentinels, protecting successively more and more sacred levels of the heavens, giving each of the guardians the appropriate password to gain admittance until one finally arrives in the presence of God himself. Interestingly, this Jewish literature was only preserved by the Christians. As the rabbis gained control of Judaism and established what would be considered orthodoxy, these writings were suppressed. Also interesting, the Jewish historian Josephus, who lived near the time of Christ and who had been a temple priest, he wrote that the veil of the Jerusalem temple was embroidered all over with celestial designs. Passing through the temple toward the throne of God represented a heavenly ascent through levels of celestial bodies. The zodiac is just another way to express this. Importantly, these Jewish pagan zodiacs are found nowhere else in Jewish art or architecture, only in the synagogues, 7 of them, from that era. Finally, in the last panel of the mosaic, we have the temple itself representing the presence of God. Like the Holy of Holies, God's throne room, where the tablets of the law were kept in the Ark of the Covenant, this part of the mosaic floor was at the inmost extent of the synagogue, abutting that niche where the Torah scroll was kept. So at least one branch of Judaism tried to preserve temple activities, including ritual heavenly ascent, after the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70 AD. This branch of Judaism died out, but its discovery puts early Christianity in a whole new light. We know that those early Christians carried out initiation rituals, mysteries that were kept secret from the world and which they said that Christ himself had administered. They spoke a great deal about passing celestial guardians in heavenly ascent. They received ritual anointings and sacred garments associated with the priesthood. And they are depicted as late as the 5th century AD with special marks on their tunics, these gamedia that we mentioned before. It's very clear to me that the ancient Christians had an endowment and other temple work that would be familiar to us. But Latter-day Saints often wonder if the ancient Israelite temple had any other functions besides the rituals of sacrifice that we read about in Leviticus. The scriptures only give subtle hints, in the Psalms especially. But if the ancient Israelites had anything that corresponds to our own endowment, we shouldn't really expect to see obvious descriptions of it in the scriptures. These early synagogues, however, suggest that there was temple work of a kind that would be familiar to us, going on in the Israelite temple. The priests wanted to preserve it, but they lost out to the rabbis. The Christians did preserve it, though, not because they were Levitical priests, but because Christ taught it to them anew. And then, of course, in our own age, that same pattern of temple worship was restored again through the prophet Joseph. There's just one further aspect of these priestly synagogues that is fascinating, and I don't pretend to have a great explanation for it. We said that the Israelite temple showed a stepwise progression into God's presence, and the Ezekiel and Moses murals at Dura Europos showed that same heavenly ascent. The floor mosaics at Beit Alpha, Hamat Tiberias, Sepphoris, and elsewhere also convey a progression in imitation of the temple. Again, we see here at Beit Alpha, with a sacrifice scene in the courtyard, the celestial designs representing the passing of the veil of the temple and navigating upward through the heavens, and finally, arrival at the heavenly temple, the literal presence of God. It seems to me that we have just the same pattern in the vignettes of our own book of Abraham, a sacrifice, not by Abraham, but of him, a pagan cosmology representing the order of the heavens, and finally, a presentation scene before Osiris, the god of resurrection, played in this instance by Abraham. What precisely this connection may be between Jewish Greek imagery on the floor of the synagogue and Jewish Egyptian imagery on papyrus in possession of a priest at Heliopolis is a mystery to me. But filled as the book of Abraham is with temple imagery, it seems to me that it can hardly be a coincidence.